Welcome to Library Seminars, a NOAA Central Library educational platform for the presentation of research and ideas in support of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's mission. My name is Lisa Clark, and I am your NOAA Central Library host. Today's presentation is the first in a four-part series sponsored by the Office of Performance, Risk, and Social Science that focuses on climate equity and environmental justice. Dr. Monica Grasso, Chief Economist from NOAA's Performance Risk and Social Science Office, will introduce today's three speakers. Before I hand over the mic, here are a few housekeeping items for your consideration. If you have trouble with the audio or visual components of GoToWebinar, we suggest that you log out and rejoin us. This resets the software and usually resolves most technical issues. Our presentation is being recorded and will be available on the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel later today. I've added a link to the chat box. Audience members are muted. However, questions are encouraged, so please feel free to type them in the questions chat box located in the control panel throughout the presentations. Let us know to whom the question is addressed by indicating the name of the person you would like to answer it. All questions will be answered at the end of the three presentations. So with that last detail, let's get started. The mic is all yours, Monica.
Lisa, thank you so much. Very happy to be here. So today's presentation are the first ones from a series of seminars NOAA is holding on climate equity and environmental justice. And one of the core services that NOAA provides is information hazard weather events. And these events can have disproportionate effects on the most vulnerable and underserved communities. These communities are often have limited capacity and resources to respond to and rebuild after extreme weather events. From lack of access to proper infrastructure for protection to the depth of services they need to recover. So we at NOAA always striving to be a better agency and serve all citizens independently of race, belief, and economic status. And we can only be successful if we understand the diverse community we serve. That's why, that's the reason that the Performance Risk and Social Science, our office, is partnering with the NOAA Library to discuss the concepts of climate equity and environmental justice, and to examine how NOAA may be better serve vulnerable and underrepresented communities. For the seminar series, we'll bring in leading scholars and researchers from academia and across the federal government to discuss their work in this field. And our goal is to share leading edge social science and foster productive collaboration that advance the agency's climate and environmental justice efforts. And I also like to take the opportunity here to announce that NOAA is also launching the We Are NOAA Week on July 26th to the 30th. This will be a week-long campaign to highlight NOAA's services and underrepresented voice aimed at advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, both internally and in supporting underserved communities. And finally, I'd like to thank our amazing speakers here today for being willing to talk with us about their work, and also to the NOAA Central Library, especially Lisa Clark, for helping us with all the logistics. And I would like to thank my team as well for their support, and special thanks to our economist, Michael Smith, for his vision and hard work for bringing the seminar series today. So now I'm gonna introduce our first speaker, Rihanna George. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at Temple University. Her research uses applied methods in microeconomics to understand the relationship between urban growth dynamics, public goods provision, and environmental regulation. Today, Dr. George will be presenting her recent work on local public finance and hurricane shocks. So I'll pass to
Okay, you can hear me now, right? Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much for including me on this really important seminar series where I can speak for my co-authors, Matthew and Gary. We're really honored to be included in this. So today I'm going to be speaking with you briefly about how hurricanes affect local public finance. Before I speak as to how this project is relevant to environmental justice and climate equity, I first want to just focus on local governments for a second. So what this chart is showing is the per capita annual expenditures that are derived from the 3 layers of government in our country. So if you separate local versus state versus federal expenditures on public goods, and plot them over time, you see an average amount spent per person as follows. And so what should strike you, there should be 2 things that stick out from this graph. So the first is that local governments, so we're talking about municipalities, townships, villages, these kinds of local levels of government actually contribute over 1/3 of the total expenditures that are spent on public goods and services that we consume as individuals in this country. So think about expenditures on education, policing, transportation, infrastructure, education, health. Over 1/3 of those expenditures that we consume in a year are actually provided at the local level. So local governments are an important provider of public goods, is the point I'm trying to make here. The second thing that should stick out from this graph is that share that local governments are providing is actually increasing over time. And so the fact that local governments are a fairly integral player in the provision of public goods in this country, that led us to ask, how are local governments affected by natural disasters, if at all, and are the provision of public goods like public works, infrastructure, transportation, are these things at all compromised by exposure to natural disasters, and in particular hurricanes? And so now that I've kind of posed that question, the other thing that we realized with this project is that the answer to that question actually has fairly strong implications for environmental justice. And the reason is because when you think about who are the types of individuals that generally rely on public goods, think about public transportation, public schools, public hospitals, these types of goods are really essential for lower income households. And that's not to say that higher income households don't utilize public schools and public transportation, of course they do, but to the degree that local public goods might be compromised or be lower quality or less of them, higher income people are better able or more easily able to substitute to the private provision of a particular public good, whereas lower income people might have a harder time doing that. The second thing that we realized with this project is that if you just look cross-sectionally at the types of communities that are more likely to be exposed to extreme weather events, or in particular, more likely to be struck by a hurricane, compositionally, communities and local governments that have a higher non-white population are more likely to be hit by a hurricane. That's just statistically true. And that's not even just driven by the fact that there's more non-whites in, say, the southern part of the United States than the northern part of the United States. Even conditioning on just looking at differences across communities within the state of Alabama or within the state of Florida, we're actually seeing that non-white communities are just more likely to be hit by a hurricane. So that's all to say that the connection between exposure to a natural disaster, and we're going to look at hurricanes with this project, and the impacts of that on local public finances does have strong environmental justice implications. And so we were curious to see what happens. So what we do with this paper is what we're going to do, or with this project, I should say, is we compare municipal finance outcomes. So we're going to focus on revenues, so tax revenues, expenditures, and also debt across communities that are hit by a hurricane versus those that are not hit by a hurricane, right? And so what we're going to try to do is to capture communities that are similar geographically, similar in their demographics, similar in, say, how wealthy they are, how close to a coastline they are, but compare a community that is that is exposed to, say, extreme hurricane events in a given time frame, compare that to another community that is exposed either to no hurricane at all or less severe hurricanes, and see how their finances are changing before relative to after the hurricane event. And so the idea here with this project is that we're trying to get as close to something like an experimental design as possible, because we want to really know what are the causal impacts of a hurricane on municipal finances. And so the idea with this project is we're kind of exploiting the fact that the timing of a hurricane itself is plausibly random. So if you are say the mayor of a community in Florida and you are trying to create a budget for the next fiscal year, you may know that there is some likelihood you'll be hit by a hurricane, but you don't know the exact timing that that hurricane will happen, and you don't know if you know, in this year a hurricane will definitely happen. So the fact that within a year time frame it's random means that any changes we see across a exposed city versus a non-exposed city, we can plausibly attribute to the hurricane itself. So just some discussion on the data that we're using for this project. So the way that we define and track hurricanes is data from the National Hurricane Center's HURDAT2 database. So this is a NOAA data product. So thank you very much to NOAA for assembling that. It's a very, very useful resource. So we're going to define a hurricane as any storm that has a maximum wind speed in excess of 64 knots. And so basically we separate the entire coastal United States into 1 kilometer grid, and then within a grid, if it is exposed to a wind speed of over 64 knots, then we say there's a hurricane that hit that piece of land. And we're going to combine the hurricane data with data from the Census of Government. So the Census of Governments is, as the name implies, a census of municipal annual budgets. So this tells us things like the tax revenues, the expenditures on sewerage, expenditures on public transportation. It also gives us information on debt for every municipal government going back to 1967. We're also going to utilize data on municipal bond ratings. So with this project, we're not only interested in how our finance is affected by hurricanes, but how is a city's ability to raise capital, issue debt, and what are the costs of issuing debt. And so we obtain data from Moody's on how they're rating bonds. So this tells us basically how the market for debt is assessing municipal risk in the aftermath of a hurricane. So these plots show kind of the geographic and time-wise variation that we're going to use with our project. So this panel on the left shows the areas. We're separating the US into counties here so that it's a little easier to see than municipalities, but you can see that the counties that are most frequently hit by hurricanes tend to be those in southern Louisiana, southern Florida, and parts of North Carolina. This graph map, I should say, on the right shows the distribution of hurricane strength over our time period. So basically most of the counties along the Gulf Coast and in southern and northern Carolina are exposed to at least one, what we're going to call major hurricane over our time period. So these are hurricanes with wind speeds in excess of 96 knots. Okay, so some discussion on our empirical approach. I know this is a lot of math. What I want you to take away from what we're doing here is we're interested in these parameters that tell us what is the effect of exposure to a hurricane on a city's revenues or expenditures or debt. We're going to look at several different outcomes. We're going to separate the effect of a hurricane between a short-term effect and a longer-term effect. So we're going to bin the outcomes in 1 to 5 years after hurricane exposure for a shorter term effect. And then we're going to look at effects in the 6 to 10 years after a hurricane. The reason for binning it into these 5 years is really a data issue. The Census of Governments reports annual outcomes once every 5 years. So we're going to look at these 5-year bins. The reason for all of these other controls is really to just generate an apples to apples comparison across municipalities. So the idea here is that we want to compare two municipalities with similar geography, similar size, similar demographics, and really just attribute any changes in the outcomes, why, as just driven by the fact that one municipality has been exposed to a hurricane in a particular time period and the other community has not. I'm happy to answer any questions about other dimensions of how we're identifying our parameters of interest. The other, I guess, outcome that we're interested in, or I shouldn't say outcome, but the other experiment that we're interested in running is differentiating minor from major storms. So we're going to basically differentiate the effects of hurricanes that have wind speeds less than 96 knots relative to the effect of hurricanes that have wind speeds in excess of 96 knots. So I'll show you results for both of these equations. Okay, so jumping to my results. So what do we find? So we find that hurricanes do in fact reduce local revenues and expenditures, particularly in the 6 to 10 years after exposure, and they do actually increase intergovernmental transfers. So what you see here is that in the first 1 to 5 years after exposure, there is a negative effect on revenues, but that it's not statistically significant, so there's no stars, but we do actually see an increase in intergovernmental transfers. The reduction in revenues really obtains after 6 to 10 years when the intergovernmental transfers go away. And we also see a decrease in expenditures on public goods, particularly public works. So these are goods like infrastructure, transportation, sanitation. So we see a reduction in public works expenditures on the order of 3.4% in the 6 to 10 years after exposure to a hurricane, right? So we think what's going on here is that in the immediate aftermath, there's this influx of intergovernmental transfers, an average of increase of 2.3%, that is helping these municipalities offset any reductions in spending. But once the transfers really kind of go away, then we see this effect obtain on revenues and expenditures, and we don't actually see these level off even 10 years after exposure to a hurricane. So there seems to be a pretty significant reduction in a city's ability to continue to finance provision of public goods. These effects are mainly driven by major storms. So all this table is showing is I'm breaking out the effects by a minor storm versus a major storm, and the major storm really seems to be driving most of our result. I'll just move on here in the interest of time. So the other thing that we're interested in is how are the hurricanes affecting a municipality's ability to hold debt or issue debt or utilize debt, and also how do hurricanes affect the assessed risk of a municipality's debt. What we see is in fact the debt outstanding falls and the default risk on municipal bonds increases. Again, the effects are much larger for major storms. So what this graph is showing is that the debt outstanding that a municipality has in the 1 to 5 and 6 to 10 years after a hurricane decreases by over 20%. And the 10-year default risk on bonds that municipality has increases by an average of half a percentage point. This is also showing a similar idea with what's happening with the increase in the default risk. So what these kind of lines are showing here is that prior to a hurricane happening, so the hurricane happens in year 0, prior to the hurricane, there's no effect of the hurricane on a municipality's default rate, which that's what we would expect if the hurricane is indeed random, like it's not having an effect on the municipality before it happens. But after the hurricane hits, then we see that the default, sorry, this should say default risk, not default rate, but the default risk increases by an average of 0.1 percentage points, and the composition of municipal debt actually changes. There's less low risk bonds and higher risk bonds. So the implication here is that not only, as I showed you with the revenues and expenditures, is kind of the immediate fiscal effect happening where the city's finance isn't able to provide public goods as easily, but its potentially long-term ability to provide public goods is impaired because the cost of debt is now increasing. Now, we were interested to see how these effects are varying by demographics of municipalities, because as I said, we were seeing that non-whites are more likely to be hit by a hurricane. And so this is a figure, I should say, we did not create this figure. The NBER created this figure, though we can take credit for the analysis behind this, I just thought that this was a really nice figure, so I decided to include it. But what this is showing is how hurricanes affect municipal revenues, differentiating by the composition of municipalities. So if we look at this panel on the left here, what we see is that your average municipality has a reduction in revenues in the aftermath of a hurricane of 1.2%. But if we look at the effect for a municipality with 1 standard deviation higher poverty rate, 1 standard deviation higher than the average, their effect is actually 2 times larger. So their reduction in revenues is 2.5% as opposed to 1.2%. We see a similar pattern if we look at municipalities with higher non-white populations. So 1 standard deviation increase in the share of the non-white population has a 2.6 higher decline in revenues relative to an average municipality, right? So it seems that these effects are much more severe for low socioeconomic status communities. How am I doing on time here? Okay, I think I'm pretty much done. So I'll just wrap up and say that what we're finding is that these hurricanes do lead to declines in revenues and expenditures. The effects are over 2 times as large for municipalities that are higher minority or poverty, or have a higher share of individuals below the poverty line. And so the implication here is that hurricanes can cause somewhat of a vicious cycle for local public finance. So not only do they impair current ability to provide public goods, but potentially future ability to finance, say, infrastructure or repairs to damages from the storm. And these effects do seem to be larger in minority and poorer communities. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much, and look forward to your questions.
And then thank you so much for this fascinating work. And it's so important for us in the federal service to better understand the real local impact of extreme weather events. Thank you. And now our second speaker is Dr. Susan Cutter. And she is a Carolina Distinguished Professor of Geography at the University of South Carolina, where she directs the Hazards and Vulnerability Research Institute. Her primary research interests are in the area of disaster vulnerability and resilience science. Dr. Cutter.
Thank you very much, Monica. It's great to be here today to talk to you a little bit about the spatial inequities in climate risk. What we need to understand are that the inequalities in disaster risk are persistent, that we see differences in racial and economic, political, gender political divides between different elements within society. We see these gaps are widening over time, and these differences between the social, political, gender, and economic divides actually are increasing at the same time that we see disaster losses and impacts increasing. And the disaster losses and impacts are increasing so fast in some places that they are accelerating beyond the capacity of places to cope with them. And as the previous speaker suggested, that they are disproportionately affecting the most disadvantaged in society. And you can see by just looking at media what has been happening over the last few years. We do see that there is considerable variability in the exposure, specifically in the event and loss patterns. On an annual basis, we can look at the billion-dollar weather events put out by NOAA's NCEI, but we can also look historically, over the last 60, 70 years or so, through the SHIELDIS database, which uses a lot of the NCEI data, to show what this pattern is across the United States based on county level events and loss patterns that are in the SHIELDIS database. And the SHIELDIS database runs from 1960 through 2019 is the most current version. And it includes 18 different types of natural hazards. And within the database, any event that created a dollar loss or one death is included in this particular database. If we focus in on the post-2000 data, specifically, what we can see is there is some differences depending on how you measure this variability. The previous map was just the total amount of loss. If we take the 20-year average and do average annual loss, you can see the distribution of natural hazard losses is consistent with wildfires in California, flooding throughout the central part of the United States, generally hurricane and flooding along the coasts when we look at that average annual loss. If we adjust it by per capita and look at our 20-year average, we could see similar patterns, but we begin to see a bit more concentration in the Great Plains states, for example. And these are just two different ways of looking at the aggregate of the loss. A different way to look at the aggregate of the loss is through something that we call relative losses. And the idea behind the relative losses, which was a paper that was published in 2013, is that $1 million loss in Los Angeles County, for example, does not have the same impact as $1 million loss in a rural South Carolina county like Calhoun County. And so what our interest was that at a national level, we think states and the country can absorb and recover in many instances. But at the more local level, what happens is we need the external aid because these places, basically the cumulative impacts are so great. And again, this is actually verifying the results of the previous speaker, which is great. The relative loss ratio is the ratio of property loss to county GDP. And unfortunately, there is no such measure as county GDP. So instead, we use the proportion of the state's employment that was in that particular county to come up with a proxy for county GDP. And what you can see is it does change the distribution of the losses a little bit. You still see areas that have very high total property losses, the map on the upper left, and they still appear in the relative loss category. But you also see emerging in the higher levels counties that have anywhere from 35% or 3.3% of their county GDP in terms of the impact of the cumulative effect of these particular events. The table here suggests that the most impacted counties are listed, it turns out that the top 25% of all the counties in the US have greater than a 10% loss of GDP based on this particular approach. Another way, and one that is more akin to looking at issues related to social equity and environmental justice, is to look at the impacts of these disaster losses on the social vulnerability of the communities, or in this instance, the counties. And this is done looking at and employing the Social Vulnerability Index. The Social Vulnerability Index really identifies those pre-existing characteristics, in this instance, counties, that produce the burdens, the social burdens of risk. And it produces and gives us an indication of the susceptibility of these counties to adverse impacts based on the underlying social characteristics of those counties. As you can see from this map here, the areas in red are those areas that have the highest levels of social vulnerability. And if you look along the Rio Grande border with Texas, the social vulnerability is really a function of ethnicity, education, poverty levels, race in some instances. And what this tells us is these are the places that really have disparities in their capability to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. You can see areas in red that are highlighted along the lower Mississippi area here, and these are indicative of African American populations, poverty levels in many of these communities, female-headed households, lack of access to automobiles, these sorts of things. You can see the Native American lands in the western part of, in the southwest here. You can also see the Native American lands in Colorado and also in the Dakotas. And you do see portions of Appalachia, for example, that stand out as well. So SOBI is a very useful tool. It's developed from ACS 5-year estimates that create this multidimensional measure that we call social vulnerability. And we use social vulnerability as really the intersection of a lot of these variables. Just because you are poor doesn't mean you are socially vulnerable. It's the combination of your economic status with your age, with your gender, with your racial and ethnic characteristics that give rise to that vulnerability. One of the ways in which SOBI is very, very useful is when you create a bivariate map that spatially shows the intersection between those places that have relatively high levels of social vulnerability and those places that have relatively high average annual losses. And these are depicted using the bivariate matrix here. And what I want to point out are those areas in red are those areas that have both very high levels of social vulnerability and also high levels of average annual loss. And the nice thing about this analytical approach is you can immediately look at the map and begin to understand what kind of policy options you should employ by simply looking at the color coding of the counties. And those areas in red, obviously, you need to employ policy options that not only mitigate the risk, but they also need to reduce the vulnerability, the underlying vulnerability of the populations. If you go over here to the blue, what you see are those areas that have a very high average annual loss, but they have basically very low levels of social vulnerability. And so the way to reduce the impact here in places, let's say Southern California, is to employ risk reduction measures to reduce the loss. And these risk reduction measures really are things related to exposure reduction, such as elevating houses in flood-prone areas, constructing levees, or employing tornado shelters, for example, in tornadic regions. And then if you go to these gray areas, what you have here is also medium levels of social vulnerability, but also high annual loss. And what you need to do in these areas is to improve the social conditions to reduce the vulnerability. We have seen instances where this social vulnerability index has in fact been used to look at, in a specific case study, how to prioritize disaster recovery. And the way in which that is done was this example from 2015 and the floods in South Carolina. And the governor came and wanted to know where the residents were most in need as a consequence of the floods. And she wanted, this was Governor Haley at the time, she wanted to employ those areas and put resources in those areas that targeted those communities that had the greatest vulnerability, but also the greatest need based on the specific flood levels. And so taking SOVI and coupling that with the FEMA verified loss tells the story of where the resources are needed to support the flood recovery. And in this instance, the dark purple area was where those resources were most in need and where the vulnerability was the highest. And what was useful to the policymakers for the state of South Carolina was this was an apolitical mechanism that enabled them to target specific areas because of the intersection of the FEMA verified losses with the pre-existing social vulnerabilities. We do find other examples of this evidentiary support for policy and action that is actually showing the relationship between exposure, impact, and underlying social vulnerability, where SOVI was used in recovery plans in multiple states, Florida to Louisiana to West Virginia to Puerto Rico. And again, providing essentially an apolitical way to demonstrate the disproportionate impact in some places. What we see is that disasters do increase the inequality in places. But we have to also understand that recognizing inequality is not the same as showing the evidentiary proof of it. And where we need to move is from demonstrating and having the evidentiary support for inequality to the next step, which is equity, and then the step after that, which is the environmental justice. And I use this slide here from the Equity Institute to show and illustrate the difference between equality versus equity. And equality, as the slide suggests, is everybody having a pair of shoes. Equity is providing everyone a pair of shoes that fit. So from a disaster perspective, equality is that risks are borne across the United States. Some have more risks than others, but it's the equity that enables some communities to not be able to handle that risk because of the uneven capacity within those communities. And those uneven capacities are a function of many factors. Among them are the social vulnerability of the populations that live there. So what would be useful is for NOAA and its parent agency, the Department of Commerce, can assist in addressing some of these issues in a number of different ways quickly. They can assist in the detection and monitoring of the spatial inequalities of climate-sensitive hazards and climate change. We do need improved social vulnerability data at local scales. The ACS is a great product, but it doesn't always have all the variables that may be necessary to do adequate social vulnerability monitoring. We need some way of assessing the relative impacts of losses on local conditions, local economic conditions. I think the previous speaker has one way of doing it. It might be useful to see if we can in fact develop a county GDP or equivalent measure that non-economists such as myself could employ in the kind of work that I do. And we need need assistance from agencies such as NOAA to provide the pathways that are necessary for enhancing the community resilience and the adaptation options across the suite of places in the United States, because there's not a one-size solution that will fit all places. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. So, and thank you so much for this presentation. It's so important for us to really have a good understanding of all the inequalities we need to consider when we are assessing climate risk. So now we have our final speaker is Dr. Emily Eisenhower. She's a postdoctoral researcher with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Office of Research and Development. Her current research work focuses on environmental justice, resilience to environmental hazards and disasters, and community capacity.
Great. Thanks so much, Monica, and NOAA for the invitation and the opportunity to share some thoughts on this panel alongside the excellent work already presented. I think I'm actually going to pick up exactly where Susan left off, and we're going to talk about community resilience. This project is a team effort of an interdisciplinary group of researchers in EPA's Office of Research and Development and our Office of Water, which supports the Urban Waters Federal Partnership. And what I'm going to share is a work in progress. It's a project that we formally started a couple years ago, but builds on some previous work. And now that the Biden-Harris administration has really opened up this window of opportunity on climate and equity, we are trying to get as much done as soon as possible. So this panel comes at a good time, and we'd love to get some feedback from you all as well. So as I said, the executive orders have opened a window of opportunity, but this kind of work is something that in particular EPA's regional offices and community partners, such as through the Urban Waters Federal Partnership, have been asking for a long time. The regional offices implement environmental laws and programs, and so for us, they're on the front line of addressing the needs of communities, and communities are really looking for help with climate adaptation and resilience, and more asking for ways to incorporate equity and social vulnerability as well. And so the goal of this research and development project is to create tools and resources to help communities with these goals. And when we say resilience planning, what we're talking about is a number of different kinds of planning work that includes the multi-sector resilience plans that communities have begun to do, as well as hazard mitigation plans, climate adaptation plans, emergency management, or disaster recovery. And it's important to talk about what we mean by resilience, because it's a term that means different things to different people. For us, it's not just withstanding or bouncing back to the previous state, which when you think about equity is clearly in many cases not desirable. As the pandemic has shown us, the need for increasing resilience goes beyond just climate or traditional disasters. And the way that we get at that is by focusing on social vulnerability, as Susan talked about earlier, but particularly the root causes of social vulnerability. So not just what it is now, what it looks like, but how it happens and how it's produced, so to speak. Because factors like poverty and health inequalities, lack of information, these are really factors that underlie all kinds of disasters and crises. And so to truly get to resilience, we have to deliberately address them. For us, resilience is inherently relational. Resilient systems have qualities of interconnectedness. As Susan also showed earlier, any given place that experiences a disaster often needs external aid. So it's the interconnectedness of communities and scales that underlies resilience, along with redundancy among systems. And resilient communities have social capital and social connections that are critical before, during, and after disasters. And finally, we recognize that resilience is a boundary object. So it's a useful concept for connecting researchers and decision makers, but it's also an umbrella term that can shift and take on different meanings. And so that's why it's important to be clear about how we're using it. So the perspective that we're taking here is a very socially centered perspective on resilience, and that's how we're addressing equity in EJ. And so to dive a little bit more deeply into environmental justice, it's usually thought of in terms of distributional and procedural justice. And those are both reflected in EPA's definition of environmental justice as fair treatment and meaningful involvement. But more recent scholarship highlights additional dimensions of environmental justice, such as recognitional justice and capabilities justice. And these are all intertwined. So recognitional justice means acknowledging the lifeways, culture, values of community and individual members that are experiencing the injustice. So for example, if we don't include elements of tribal culture that affect how people are exposed to pollutants, then we're not really achieving a distributional justice, nor in many cases procedural justice, by understanding how people need to be included in processes. And I'm oversimplifying a bit here, trying not to get too much into the weeds, but yeah, and so capabilities then are both capacities and distributional outcomes. They're the health, social, and economic resources and autonomy that people need in order to be able to fully realize human potential and opportunity. And so addressing environmental justice is really about addressing all of these different dimensions. So as I mentioned, this project is developing a tool and a process of using it. And the method that we're using to do this is called human-centered design. which puts at the center of product development user needs and understanding our users. So we start with discovery activities with potential users, which generates insights about their needs and about the context in which they're doing resilience planning and looking for information and ways of engaging the community. And then we move on to ideation and prototyping, in which we brainstorm and design solutions. And the iterativity of this method and the focus on user needs allows us to minimize the cost and time for developing something and ensure its utility, which is important given the urgency of the need for approaches like this. So we're calling this tool the Equitable Resilience Builder, and this is our problem statement. How might we help personnel from under-resourced jurisdictions to inclusively assess vulnerability and resilience to carry out equitable planning and actions? And our target audience are city and county level personnel without the kinds of resources to hire consultants or collect extensive data that larger cities might have. And this is a self-assessment process to identify risks, vulnerabilities, and actions. And so what we're not trying to do is replicate existing indices and data tools like the ones that Susan just showed, in which CDC and Census and FEMA all have also versions of. We are building on the previous work of some in our team, including a coupled human and natural systems framework of community resilience and a multi-sector urban resilience evaluation tool. And currently we're in the process of completing a literature review of the social sciences literature on social vulnerability to hazards and disasters, developing a framework for linking vulnerability factors to specific hazards, impacts and actions, and we'll begin with some case studies with urban, rural, tribal, and underserved communities in the fall. So last fall, we held 2 discovery workshops where we did storytelling and identifying key needs and questions, and then an ideation workshop for brainstorming potential solutions. We invited practitioners from state, local, tribal, and resilience planning offices, public health, emergency managers, environmental programs, public works, nonprofits, foundations, and academia. And some of the insights that we got from these discovery workshops were that relationships underlie effective resilience work. And this is particularly evident now with COVID, that it's creating new relationships and strengthening existing ones as communities figure out how to respond to this. And those relationships allow them to respond and will allow them also to respond to future disasters and crises. Lack of awareness and capacity are barriers. Under-resourced jurisdictions tend to rely heavily on expertise and technical assistance, particularly from universities. They're looking for everything from, an ear to, direct assistance with their planning activities. Crises and disasters create trauma that can be a barrier to action for people and for the planners and the practitioners who are working in this area. So it's something that needs to be acknowledged and addressed when we talk about planning and increasing resilience. Data that just tells you how you're vulnerable is frustrating. Often communities know the ways that they're vulnerable, at least they have a sense of it, but data that helps implement actions is exciting. So they're really looking for the kind of information that leads to action. And for us, in particular, EPA regional staff often feel that they're working in silos between different programs and are looking for ways to integrate resilience into their work, particularly now, in just raising awareness about what communities may be facing. And so based on what we learned in the ideation workshop, we have decided on these design principles that the tool we're developing will build relationships and trust within communities, use data and local knowledge, including about context and history, recognize trauma, facilitate action, be accessible for under-resourced communities, and be flexible and adaptable for different planning needs. And so, generally, the process begins with engaging community members in order to understand the history of experiences with disasters, needs, roles of different organizations and people doing work in the community, self-assessing vulnerabilities by looking at hazards, impacts, inequities, and root causes, prioritizing urgent action areas, identifying sector-specific and community-based actions. Taking action often requires partnerships and collaborations, and monitoring and learning. And so that was all that I was going to share today. So we might have a few minutes and for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for all your presentations today. I encourage the panelists to come back to the screen. And audience, we have about 5 minutes for your questions. So if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and enter them in the questions chat box in the control panel. And while we wait for questions, I encourage you to download the slides from a few of our speakers today. You can also find them in the handouts drop-down box in the control panel. So let me see. Thank you again. That was wonderful. This first is it's actually a compliment to everybody. It says, I just want to thank such a smart and strong group of women leaders for this presentation on equity and climate justice today. Fabulous program. Thank you. I agree. And another compliment, it's such interesting presentations. Thank you. Here's another question. What can be learned from forest resiliency that the Department of Agriculture has dealt with?
I will maybe offer one thing that I know that the Forest Service has been working on, particularly out in California, is learning from ways that indigenous groups have dealt with managing forests and dealt with fires historically. And I don't have a lot of details on it. I could probably find, if someone wants to email me, but I know that there is some really exciting work happening on learning from the ways that indigenous groups have traditionally dealt with forests and forest fires.
Thank you for taking on that question. We do have another question. This is specifically for Dr. George. Have green or social impact bonds been used to help localities with vulnerable populations recover from hurricanes and to overcome the cost of traditional debt?
The question is, have they been used? So I know that
yes,
green bonds are definitely a tool that that investors are trying to get more municipalities to utilize to kind of factor in some of this climate related risk. But to the extent that they're kind of targeted towards low SES communities, that I don't actually know. That's a great question. But it seems like it should be, since those are areas that seem to be more affected by these disasters. I know that they are kind of an increasingly, I don't know if they're more increasingly utilized, but certainly if you look at sort of the annual reports of agencies like Moody's or Fitch or S&P, they're certainly talking about these a lot more. They want people to know that these are products that they offer, but I don't know if they're actually being utilized in a way we would want.
Excellent, thank you for answering. Next question asks, is Emily's index available online or is it still in development?
We actually are not developing an index. We are working with some indicators, and it is still in development. So we will hopefully have a beta version. We're going to be beginning in the fall with some case studies. So beta, at least hopefully by then.
Thank you. Next question asks, can you talk about climate gentrification that may change a community's vulnerabilities and displace higher risk marginalized people?
I could say a little bit about that, and then I don't know if the others I want to weigh into, particularly because I am from Miami. That's where I did my dissertation research, and I know that there's been quite a bit written about that in Miami. And one of the things I want to point out, though, is that the gentrification that was happening in Miami, where people were moving back to sort of higher ground areas because that's where the historic, settlements were built. It's historic downtown, kind of areas. that predates concerns about climate change. And it actually, unfortunately was related, somewhat to sustainability pushes, where Miami is between the ocean and the Everglades. And so in order to preserve the Everglades, we need to have an urban boundary. And that was, prompting also some more development in the inner city core. And so, as cities change and markets change, unless we have specific policies in place to that anticipate things like gentrification and deal with it, it's really hard to kind of address it after the fact. So I think it's another thing where, climate change, sea level rise may be exacerbating something that was already happening previously.
I'll just add a few thoughts there. My understanding is, at least as it relates to hurricanes, climate gentrification is a little bit of it's hard to really pin down what's happening, because there's kind of two competing forces going on. One is that when you think about people who can more easily move, it tends to be higher income people, actually. So so in that respect, it's almost like there is some sort of climate gentrification going on, but on the other side, there's a lot of research that shows lower income people, at least in response to Hurricane Katrina, they were the ones that tended to move, and actually they on average had like higher wages and better jobs because they were kind of moving to these more productive locations. So it's not, I guess what I'm saying is from at least the economics research, it's not entirely clear that there is kind of what we would call like negative gentrification happening as a result of hurricane exposure. But what I can say is from the results of our research with this project, it does look like we can't say anything about the average incomes of the remaining communities that stay after they've been exposed to a hurricane. We just didn't have good enough data to pin that down. But certainly the average housing values are falling. And so the implication is just the resources of these communities are falling, whether or not that's the average income of a remaining household is lower or higher, we don't know, but certainly the average value of housing is falling, and so it seems like the resources for these communities is on average lower.
I think as well, it's very place specific, because if you look at the Mississippi Gulf Coast, for example, after Katrina, one of the transformations was the conversion of apartment buildings into higher rent condos. And so a lot of the renters were displaced out of the immediate vicinity, the coastal counties, and had to move inland. So one could think of that as an example of climate gentrification. But for every example, there's a counterfactual example as well. So it's really, I think, place and time specific.
Thank you all for answering that question. Unfortunately, we've gone over the hour, so and there are other questions, but if you have asked a question, I do plan on sending them to the speakers so that they can answer them offline. And I do want to just quickly send something in the chat right now. This is a comment from one of our listeners who says, I'd like to point people to NOAA Fisheries Community Social Vulnerability Indices as another example of important work in this area. So I'm going to go ahead and enter that right now into the chat so that anyone who's interested can take a look. Any last comments from our speakers before we end our presentation? No?
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you.
Great job. It was nice to meet you both.
Likewise.
Great to meet you both. Yeah. Yeah, great to meet you both.
This is the fun part, right? And how seamlessly they went from one to the other in terms of content. That was great.
Yeah,
Great.
it worked well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I learned so much. Very exciting stuff. Very exciting stuff.
Me too.
Monica, you talked about, or there's the idea is doing a white paper Rihanna?
Yes. So we are planning to put together a white paper. We have a series, I think, of 4 seminars, and then we're going to be compiling white paper. Probably Michael will be reaching out to you. But thank you so much.
Right.
Those are all fascinating work. And yeah.
Okay,
Thanks
great.
so much
Thanks so
for
much for the
working.
opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.